Welcome back to Stories in the Inglenook, Part 3 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, read from the USBORNE Complete Dickens, All the Novels Retold. Oliver gradually recovered in the care of Mr. Brownlow and his housekeeper. Mr. Brownlow bought him a smart new suit and asked him to come to his study. "I want you to pay attention to what I'm about to say," he said. "Oh, please don't send me away, sir," Oliver begged. "My dear child," said Mr. Brownlow, deeply moved, "I will never desert you as long as you give me no reason. To show you how much I trust you, I will entrust you with an errand." "Yes, please, sir," said Oliver, delighted to be of use. Mr. Brownlow handed him a £5 note. "I owe the bookseller £4.10. Take him this and bring me the change." "I won't be 10 minutes, sir," Oliver said eagerly. The housekeeper watched him as he headed down the street. "Bless his sweet face, I can't bear to let him out of my sight." As Mr. Brownlow waited for Oliver to return, the room slowly grew so dark that he could scarcely see the face of the clock. Oliver had nearly reached the bookstall, thinking how happy he was, when he heard a cry, "Oh, my dear sweet brother!" and he found a pair of arms wrapped firmly around his neck. It was Nancy. "He ran away from his respectable, hard-working mother and father to join a band of thieves," she said to the passers-by, who stared as Oliver struggled in her grip. "I'm an orphan," Oliver protested. "Stop pretending and get home to your poor mother," said a rough voice. Bill Sikes strode out of a beer shop to join them. The people in the street shook their heads at Oliver, convinced he was a hardened little wretch. So nobody protested as he was dragged off into the winding streets that led to the thieves' den. Fagin grinned as Sikes brought the boy in. "If you'd let us know you were coming, I'd have had something hot on for supper." "Ha ha! Just look at him!" Charlie Bates laughed, pointing at Oliver's fine new suit. "I'll look after that one for you for Sunday best," Fagin told him. "The Dodger will give you some other clothes." The artful Dodger said nothing, but was rifling through Oliver's pockets. He found the £5 note at once, which Bill Sikes claimed. "That'll be mine for bringing ye the boy." "But it belongs to the kind old gentleman," said Oliver. He fell to his knees and begged, "Please give it back to him. Keep me if you like, but at least return his money. They'll think I stole it." "Ah, yes, they will," said Fagin thoughtfully. "I couldn't have planned it better myself." Oliver suddenly leaped to his feet and shot out of the door. But Charlie Bates and the Dodger were quicker and brought him back, wriggling between them. "Wanted to escape and call the police for help, did you?" Fagin said, all his nastiness suddenly revealed. "I'll teach you." He hit Oliver hard and was about to hit him again when Nancy flung herself between them. "I won't let you, Fagin," she cried. "You've got him back. What more do you want?" She stomped her foot, her face white with rage. So Fagin left Oliver alone. He was given back his old ragged suit of clothes and shown to a thin bunk in the next room. The following day, an announcement appeared in the newspaper. 5 guineas reward. Oliver Twist left, or was enticed from his home, last Thursday night. Reward for any information which might lead to the discovery of the boy or throw any light on his history. Who should see it and come sniffing for the reward at Mr. Brownlow's house but Mr. Bumble? He had spotted the announcement in the newspaper that morning and thought it an easy way to earn a quick 5 guineas. He told Mr. Brownlow a long story of Oliver's history, describing a no-good, villainous boy who had viciously attacked his employer's wife and shop-boy and run away in the night. He left no doubt in Mr. Brownlow's mind that Oliver was not worthy of his love. Heartbroken, Mr. Brownlow paid the beadle and showed him out. "I won't believe it," said his housekeeper when he told her. "He was a dear, grateful child. Nothing can make me think otherwise." Oliver, meanwhile, was kept inside the thieves' den, and Fagin and the others tried to persuade him to join them in their work. "If we don't take the wipes and watches, some other cove will," reasoned the Dodger. "We have as much right to 'em as anyone." "I'd rather not," Oliver sighed. Every day the boys played the old game with Fagin, with Oliver there too, always invited to join in, and Fagin told such funny stories of past robberies that Oliver laughed despite himself. And in such a way the wily old villain slowly instilled into the boy's soul a poison which he hoped would blacken it forever. Oliver awoke one morning to find a new pair of shoes near his bed. He was delighted, until Fagin told him he was working with Bill Sikes that night. "Mind you do what he says," Fagin said, deadly serious. "He's a rough man, and will think nothing of hurting you if you don't." Nancy came to fetch him. She was pale and looked miserable as Oliver slipped his little hand in hers. As they hurried along, Oliver thought to cry for help, but she seemed to read his thoughts. "You cannot escape," she told him. "I'm saving you as much as I can. That's why I came instead of Sikes. He's rougher than me. Have a heart, Oliver. If you run away from me, he'll kill me." Oliver glanced at the bruises on her arms and didn't have the heart to try. In the back room of a dingy house, they met Bill Sikes. "Did he come quiet?" he growled at Nancy. "Like a lamb," she said. Sikes bent down and pressed a pistol to Oliver's pale temple. "If you speak a word when you're out with me, except when I speak to you, I'll unload this pistol into you. Do you hear?" Oliver nodded, trembling in terror. Buttoning his dark overcoat, Sikes led Oliver out of the door. They walked, hitched a ride in the back of a cart, walked again, and met another man at a dark, foggy corner. Toby Crackit was his name. He had corkscrewing, long, dirty orange curls, through which he ran his ring-encrusted, filthy fingers. He was expecting them. "Got everything we need?" he asked. Sikes nodded, and together they walked on. It was now the dead of night. They stopped by a house surrounded by a wall. Before Oliver could wonder what they were doing there, Toby Crackit had shinned up the wall. "Hoist the boy up," he said. And Sikes caught him under the arms and lifted him up to the wall. In a twinkling, they were lying on the grass on the other side. Sikes joined them, and they began to sneak towards the house. In despair, Oliver realized that the point of the expedition was housebreaking and robbery, if not murder too. A cold sweat broke out on his brow, and he sank to his knees in horror. Sikes hauled him up. "Behave or I'll kill you here and now." They crept to a small window at the side of the house, and Sikes forced it open with a crowbar. "Now listen," he said to Oliver. "You're to go in. Go to the front door and open it to let us in." He put Oliver through the window, feet first, holding on to his collar, and he lowered him down quietly to the floor. "Take this lantern," he said, putting it through the window too. He pointed his gun at Oliver and hissed, "Now go!" There came a tiny noise. "What was that?" whispered the other man. They both listened intently. "Nothing," said Sikes. "Oliver, go." Oliver had decided that, whether he died in the attempt or not, he would try to alert the family. He tiptoed across the room. "Someone's coming! Come back!" Sikes called suddenly. There was a loud cry. Oliver dropped the lantern. Two half-dressed men appeared from inside the house. A flash, a loud noise, smoke, a crash. He staggered backwards. Bill Sikes hauled him back to the window. He fired his pistol, and then the robbers fled. "Curse it! The boy's been hit," said Sikes. Oliver heard the ringing of a bell, more shots and shouts. He felt himself being carried over uneven ground at a fast pace. Then everything grew distant. A cold feeling spread over his heart, and he saw and heard no more. The night was bitterly cold, the snow whipped up by a howling wind. It was the kind of night for the housed and fed to sit around a warm fire, and for the homeless and starving to lay down and die. On such a night, a poor old woman lay dying in the workhouse where Oliver was born. She wanted to confess something before she died. "I once nursed a pretty young thing, her feet bleeding from walking so far," she told the matron. "She came here, had a baby, a boy, and died. She wasn't cold when I took it from her." "Took what?" the matron asked impatiently. "She asked me to keep it safe," the old woman rambled feverishly. "It was gold. It might have paid for food and shelter. It might have kept her safe. They might have treated the boy better had they known. He grew so like her, I never could forget. Oliver, they called him." "What did you steal?" But the old woman only mumbled to herself a little more, then clutched the matron's hand and lay back and died. Now let us return to poor Oliver. The robbers were fleeing, but Sikes was slow, carrying the unconscious boy. "Leave him and run!" cried Crackit. Men and dogs were catching them up, so Sikes lay Oliver in a ditch and ran. The voices faded. Fog rolled over him. Dawn broke, and he lay there still. Eventually, Oliver awoke with a cry of pain. Realizing that if he stayed there, he would surely die, he crawled painfully to the house. He knocked on the door and collapsed on the doorstep. "One of the robbers!" cried the butler. "It's the one I shot." "Is he badly hurt?" said a young woman. "Carry him upstairs." In the drawing-room of the house, this young woman and an older lady waited as the doctor attended to Oliver upstairs. Rose Maylie was not past 17, with deep blue eyes that shone with goodness. The older lady, Mrs. Maylie, regarded her fondly as she waited for the doctor's report. "He is not so badly hurt," said the doctor, and he led them upstairs to see him. From the butler's reports of his own bravery, they expected to see a villainous-looking, hardened criminal. "But he's just a child!" exclaimed Mrs. Maylie, when she saw Oliver lying in bed asleep. "Crime is not reserved for the old," said the doctor. Rose brushed Oliver's hair off his forehead, and he stirred and smiled. "But this delicate boy doesn't look capable. Even if he has been wicked, think how he may never have known a mother's love. Neglect and bad treatment may have driven him to it. Aunt, think how I may have struggled had I not had you to care for me. Oh, please pity this poor boy. Don't let them take him to prison. I would not harm a hair on his head, Mrs. Maylie promised. When Oliver finally awoke, he told them his life story so far. It was a solemn thing to hear, the tremulous voice of a weak little child saying all of the terrible things that had befallen him. They sent the police away, saying the boy had nothing to do with the failed burglary, and Oliver thrived in their care and was happy. Every day, as he regained his strength, Oliver said how thankful he was for their kindness and how he would do anything to help in return. I wish I could thank Mr. Brownlow, too, he said. And so, when he was better, the doctor, who was a family friend of the Maylies, took Oliver to Mr. Brownlow's house. To Oliver's dismay, they found it shut up and empty. "He's gone to the West Indies, and his housekeeper too," said a servant from next door. It was the only thing to mar Oliver's happiness. He would have loved Mr. Brownlow to know that his trust had not been misplaced, but soon the Maylies took him to their countryside house, and it was impossible not to find peace of mind there. He gathered flowers for Rose, walked in the balmy countryside, and studied, and he grew strong and sure in their love. But in London, dark shadows lurked. One shadow in particular. It was a strange man with wild eyes, who rarely showed his face. He had been asking after Oliver. He had asked Fagin about him, and cursed Sikes for losing Oliver the night of the botched burglary. And now he sat in a public house, eyeing the fellow who came in. The fellow was Mr. Bumble, and he was surprised when the stranger pushed a couple of gold coins across to him and said, "I've been waiting for you. There's more money if you can give me information. Think back 12 winters to the workhouse. A boy was born, sent to work at the undertaker's. I wish he'd made the boy a coffin and buried him in it. He ran away." "Oh, you mean Oliver Twist?" said Mr. Bumble. "There was a woman who nursed his mother. Where is she?" "She died last winter," said Mr. Bumble, who had heard it from the matron of the orphanage. Seeing the possibility of more money fading, he added, "But I know who was with her when she died." "How can I find her?" said the man. "I'll bring her to you tomorrow," Mr. Bumble replied. The stranger scribbled on a scrap of paper, "Be at this address at 9 in the evening by the river. Ask for Monks." The next night, under glowering clouds and the rumble of thunder, Mr. Bumble took the matron of the orphanage with him to the waterfront. She was as eager as he was for the money, and cared as little what it might mean for Oliver. They found the address, a ruinous, deserted warehouse, and went in. Monks was there, and the matron told him all. "As she died, she pressed something into my hand," she finished. "It was a scrap of paper from a pawnshop. I collected what she had pawned, and here it is." She threw down a little drawstring bag. In it was a gold locket, with 2 locks of hair inside, and a wedding ring, with the name Agnes engraved on it. Monks thrust money at her, and seized the bag with the locket and ring. He opened a trap door in the floor of the warehouse, tied the bag to a lead weight, and flung it into the rushing river below. "Never say a word about this," he warned them, "to anyone." Meanwhile, Bill Sikes was in hiding. He disappeared after the failed burglary and was holed up in a tiny room with Nancy to bring him what he needed. He was lying in bed, his temper having in no way improved from being ill. "How do you feel tonight, Bill?" Nancy asked.
"Weak as water,"
he growled. Just then Fagin arrived, bringing a stolen rabbit pie for Sikes.
"I need money, not pie. You need to give me some,"
Sikes said. Fagin reluctantly agreed, and took Nancy back to his den to collect it. Just as she sat down, there was the sound of someone coming through the door below.
"That's just the man I was expecting," Fagin said. "I won't be long, Nance."
The visitor was Monks. He eyed Nancy suspiciously as Fagin led him to the room she was sitting in, and they went upstairs to talk. Nancy slipped off her shoes and crept after them, silent as a mouse, to eavesdrop on their conversation. Moments later she returned, looking shaken. She sat down quickly as the two men entered the room.
"You're pale, Nancy,"
said Fagin, after showing the man out. "Pa," said the girl, "it's all that sitting in a stuffy room. Give me the money then, and I'll get back." Outside, she sat down on a street corner and burst into tears. Then she wiped her eyes and hurried back to Bill Sikes. The following day, Nancy was agitated, and it grew worse towards evening. Bill Sikes suspected something.
"What's the matter?" he roared at her. "What are you thinking of?"
"Nothing," she said lightly, a little too lightly, for he was still suspicious.
"You're up to something," he bellowed. "Give me a drink."
She poured a drink with her back to him and handed it over. He seized her arm and gripped it tightly.
"You sit here with me and put your usual face back on, or I'll rearrange it for you so you won't recognize it when you look in the mirror," he snarled.
Knocking back the drink, he lay down. Soon his group listened, and he began to snore. "The sleeping draught has worked," Nancy murmured. "I'd better hurry. I may be too late even now." She put on her bonnet and shawl and hurried off into the night. The clock was striking 10 as she tore along, elbowing people out of the way, and darting across the street between horses and carriages until she reached a smart hotel in Hyde Park.
"What do you want?" the lady at the door asked scornfully.
"I need to speak to a lady," Nancy said. "A Miss Maylie." The doorman, the lady, and the chambermaids all eyed her in disdain.
"She won't see the likes of you," said the lady.
"You'll have to carry me out of here unless you take my message," Nancy said fiercely. "All you have to say is that I want to speak to her. She can decide whether she wants to hear me or not." The footman went to ask and returned saying Miss Maylie would see her. He led Nancy into a room where a beautiful young girl waited. "It was hard to get to see you, lady," Nancy said, trying to sound as if she didn't care. "I'm sorry if anyone has behaved harshly to you," Rose replied, with such kindness that Nancy burst into tears. "Oh, lady," she wept, "if there was more like you, there'd be fewer like me." "Sit down," Rose begged earnestly. "If I can help you, I will."
"Is the door shut?"
Nancy asked. "Yes," Rose said nervously. "Why?" "Because I'm about to put my life in your hands with what I'm about to tell you. Do you know a man named Monks?" "No," said Rose. "Well, he knows you," said Nancy, "and he's coming after Oliver. I overheard him talking to an old thief called Fagin. He said he wanted Oliver turned bad into a thief, and also that the only proof of Oliver's true identity lay at the bottom of the river." "What?" said Rose. "It's the truth," Nancy said. "He said that if he could do it without risking his own neck, he'd kill Oliver, but at the very least, he'd watch his whole life and make sure he came to no good or lay such traps for my brother Oliver," he said. "His brother?" Rose exclaimed. "That's what he said," said Nancy. "But now I must get back," she said, paling at the thought of Sikes finding her gone. "Stay," Rose said, "and let me help you. Let me save you." Nobody had ever been so kind to Nancy, and she fell to her knees with gratitude. Dear, sweet angel lady, had I heard these words years ago, they might have saved me. But it's too late now. It's never too late, Rose cried. It is, said Nancy. I couldn't desert Sykes, even though he abuses me so. I'm bound to him. He's all I ever had. But how can I use this information? Rose said. How can I contact you if I need to? Nancy hesitated. I'll be on London Bridge between 11 and midnight every Sunday from now. If you need me, find me there. And the poor girl hurried away again into the night, and Rose Maylie sank into a chair to collect her wandering thoughts. Rose was still wondering what to do the following morning when Oliver burst into the room, weeping in delight. I have just seen Mr. Brownlow, he cried. He was going into a house. I didn't dare speak to him just then, but I have his address. I'll take you there at once, Rose said. A few minutes later, they were in a hackney coach and on their way. Rose left Oliver waiting in the coach while she went in to introduce herself. You once showed great kindness to a young friend of mine, she told Mr. Brownlow, and I thought you would like to hear of him. His name is Oliver Twist. Mr. Brownlow was astonished. When Rose told him all that had happened to Oliver since leaving his house, and that Oliver himself was waiting outside, Mr. Brownlow beamed with joy and ran downstairs to embrace him. He called his housekeeper, who wept for happiness to see the dear little boy again. While she and Oliver caught up with one another, Rose went to speak with Mr. Brownlow in private. She confided in him everything that Nancy had told her, and he immediately promised to help. The clock was chiming 11:45 as two figures walked onto London Bridge on a Sunday night. The first wore a bonnet and shawl and glanced quickly around her as she went. The second she didn't see, but it slunk behind her like a shadow. On the bridge, a carriage waited, with Rose and Mr. Brownlow inside. Seeing the girl, they got out of the carriage and went to meet her. We looked for you last Sunday, Rose whispered. I couldn't come. Sykes won't let me out unless he knows where I'm going, but I slipped him another sleeping draught tonight, the girl said. Come, I'm afraid to talk in the open. She pulled them down the stairs at the side of the bridge. The shadow followed and lurked, close enough to listen. We need a description of this man, Monks, the gentleman told her. You can trust us. We will not reveal you, but you must give up Fagin and the others. This concludes the end of Part 3 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Thank you for listening. Please proceed to video Part 4.